Okay, everyone. So in this second video, I'm going to go over the theories of term structure. So in other words, we are going to discuss three important theories that discuss the factors affecting the yield curve or the return to a security. One of the important theories is about expectations. And the good thing about this theory, it makes sense. So if I'm expecting interest rate to increase, then the yield curve would be sloping upwards. So the expectation theory is basically saying that anytime I'm expecting an increase in the rates or in the yields, then the yield curve is going to have an upward sloping curve. And the opposite is true. Okay, so it's the shape is only determined by expectations, and this is about an expectation theory. So the graphs here discuss this theory. So for example, if we are expecting, let's assume that the red curves are the original points, original intersection, then S1 and D1 is just the original equilibrium. If we assume that we have a 3 months security, which is the treasury bond, it's risk-free, then anytime you're expecting an increase in interest rate, then people are going to supply more of their funds. So the supply of funds is going to increase. However, people who are demanding funds, we're going to demand less funds because the cost of borrowing increases. So we are going to reach a new equilibrium point, which is the blue lines. At I2, the interest rate is going to fall. Okay, so this is if we're expecting higher interest rate. And the opposite is true. Lower interest rate, expecting lower interest rate, the interest rate is going to increase. The same thing happened here. So if I'm assuming that long-term security, I have a long-term security, what's going to happen with the long-term security? So in the long-term security, assume that this is S1 and D1. We have the original equilibrium. And now suppose that we're expecting that there is a sudden increase, when I say sudden, then it's right away, it's going to happen right away, increase in interest rate. Then this is a reaction of, this graph is a reaction of a short term, this is a reaction on the long term. Then if there is a sudden increase, I want you to think about it on the long term, it's going to decrease. Okay, so a sudden increase happens in the short run, but the opposite happens on the long run. So if there's a sudden increase in the short run, then in the long run, we're going to have the opposite scenario. So the two red lines is the original intersection at I1. Now, with the expected long-term increase, people will supply less, so we go to the left, and people demand more, so we go to the right, until we reach a new equilibrium point at I2. And the opposite happens if I'm expecting lower interest rate, then the interest rate on the long term is going to fall. The yield curve is simply a relationship between the yield or the interest and the time, the term to maturity. You can call it the time, you can call it the term to maturity. So over time, there is an increase in the yield curve. There is a positive relation of the yield curve with time if I'm expecting higher interest rate. What about this one? There is a decrease if I'm expecting a lower interest rate. I want you to think about this graph and this graph, like the first one as a short term, and the long run, is the second ones. Okay. So the pure expectation theory is just showing us that the interest rate or the yield or the annualized interest rate for 2 years security is simply the annualized interest rate of a 1 year security multiplied times my expected interest rate or anticipated interest rate for time t plus 1. This is time t, this is time t plus 1, or my expectation of the next year. and this is going to be the current interest plus the expected one. The other, or the second theory, is about liquidity. And this theory is basically confirming the expectation theory, but it is adding to it a premium for liquidity. This one is telling us that investors would prefer liquid securities. If they are willing to wait long time, then they have to be compensated for waiting, and this is called a premium. In this theory, they are showing us in 3 graphs that represent different scenarios. One, if I'm expecting the market interest rate to be stable. One, if I'm expecting it to be increased. One, if I'm expecting interest rate to fall or decrease. So if it is stable, then this is the liquidity premium. But if I'm allowing to, or if the liquidity premium is removed, but if I'm supposed to wait for a long time, I have to be compensated, so there is a premium. This is without a premium, and this is with the premium. This is an expected increase, so it's positive. I want you to refer to this part of the graph, this one, the last one, and the last one. Term to maturity and yield, because these two are repeated. So, and again, term to maturity, yield. If I'm expecting an increase, then it's a positive relationship, and I have to be compensated by a premium. If I'm expecting a fall, then it's going to be a negative relationship, and at the meantime, I have also to be compensated by a premium. That's all about the liquidity theory. The segmented market theory is basically telling us that investors will choose security with maturities that satisfy their forecasted cash needs. So we assume that these investors are able to determine the maturity of different securities, and they will say, okay, I want in 6 months from now, I need this amount of cash. So they will be able to determine which security they are going to invest in. Of course, there are so much flexibility in the actual markets. Like, even if you can determine it now, we can always change it later. Okay, and also the habitat theory is basically saying that the investors and borrowers can basically concentrate on a particular security, a particular maturity market. Okay, and they can always change it, so it's not fixed as it is assumed here. This theory assumes that it's better for you to determine your market in advance, but in real life, you have more flexibility because you can always switch from one security to another one by selling it to another person or selling it in the secondary market. Okay. All right. So let me put the 3 theories together. So if we put the 3 theories together, or the 3 conditions, the first one assumes that about expectation. I'm expecting interest rate to rise. However, borrowers, when you borrow money, you need to keep it for long, but when you invest, you need to get your money back as soon as possible. Investors, they prefer actually liquid securities. So if you put all these in graph, then this is about expectation theory, right? So as I said, you can refer to this graph back here. It's exactly this graph, expecting a positive increase in interest rate. So if I'm expecting positive increase in interest rate, which is the first condition, expecting interest rate to rise, then it's a positive relationship, the green line. And then if I have to wait long time, I need a premium. So this distance here is the compensation of the premium, right? So E is about the expectation, S is the premium for not having a short-term security, and this is the premium for a security that is not liquid. Okay, so E is the expectation theory, S refers to the premium that you will need to take because the security is not short-term, L refers to the additional premium that you will need to take in order to compensate for illiquid security. Okay, so the shape of this yield curve is kind of combining the three together. Okay, so it's basically about the expectation of future markets, but it keeps on shifting upwards to make up for the different types of premiums. Okay. All right, I want you to read the rest of the slides. I'm gonna stop here, and the rest of the slides are kind of making sense, so just read them and let me know if you have any questions. So it's basically about integrating the three theories. Let me just refer to this part. Where is it? I'm sorry. Yeah, so this slide, I want you to read it, which is the use of the term structure to make the decisions. Okay, decisions about which security are you going to buy as an investor, and the decisions about the future. Okay, in terms of when the bond is going to mature. So you have different securities, and when you need to determine when these bonds or these securities are going to mature. Okay, so I want you to read the rest of the slides.